Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. He thrust out Widow's Wail and slashed it right and left. As with the spears, any dead thing unlucky enough to find itself cut by Valyrian steel fell immediately. Any who avoided it found the flames that covered it were not so easy to move away from. Though, mayhap the dead just never even tried to move away from them, he thought darkly. A loud roar rang out, and he looked to the sky to see the king. Lightbringer shining brightly in his hand, led Rhaegal to the back of their lines. Another roar saw the green dragon now fly over their heads, and once it had cleared them, the flames were loosed once more. Gilzioni felt the heat from where he stood, and watched as the dead, who'd been caught by the flames, all but exploded in front of him. It relieved the pressure on their lines, and allowed them to form a truer shield wall. This one would be much harder to break, and though he knew Aegon could not see him, he nodded his head in thanks regardless. Moving away from the lines, he bid the archers line up once more. Knock! Aim! Loose! Again the sky was filled with flaming arrows, and as he looked down the lines he saw the Dornish and the Unsullied were doing as he was. Grey Worm. Ser Jorah, Ser Daemon Sand, and Ned Dane were good and true men to fight alongside. Should this be his last day, then it would be one he was proud of. Knock! Aim! Loose! He called out one more time before the air turned cold. The wind picked up, and the arrows that flew in the sky did so with their flames extinguished. When he looked to Widow's Wail, he saw that it too had lost its flame, and so he raced to the front of the lines once more. To his great relief, the dragons still flew and still laid down their fire, and Lightbringer shone as truly as ever. To his horror, tall, thin, icy-covered figures now moved across the ground in front of him, and though they were not quite the white shadows of the north, he'd named them as White Walkers too. Take them down! Aim at the White Walkers! His words rang around, and he readied himself for the fight that he knew was to come. A fight he was unsure he'd see the end of. Grey Worm, his queen, and Drogon led the way from the sky, while he, the Unsullied, and Ser Jorah Mormont did the same from the ground. With spear and shield, they held the line when the attack finally came. Behind them, the Doxley fired arrows from atop their horses, and for a while at least. The dead were no match for any of them. Grey Worm knew that at some point that may change, and the fight could become much harder. He knew too that at some point the Doxley would ride and ride hard, and the dead would suffer greatly because of it. What he didn't know was which would happen first. To his left, he could see Jaime Lannister and Jon Connington lead the king's men, while further down the line, the princess's husband Ned Dane and Ser Daemon Sand led the men of Dorne. Far back from the lines, Missandei was safe with the princess and her guards. Just knowing that was so had allowed him to concentrate on playing his own part in the battle here today. Thrusting his spear forward as he had been trained to do, he barely felt it when it made contact with the dead flesh of the things that attacked his lines. It had become routine to him. Shield held in front of him, spear moving back and forth, and the dead falling one by one. When he or any in the front lines tired, they were quickly replaced by the next line of men behind them. They did this with an easy practice, waiting for just the right moment, so that the line would remain unbroken and the momentum never swung from them to their enemies. He heard the loud calls for arrows to be fired from the king's men that were nearest to him. Jon Connington on horseback as he rode down the back of those lines and shouted out his orders, while at the front of them, Jaime Lannister did likewise. He doubted it was the same with the Dornish lines as both Ned Dane and Daemon Sand would. He wagered be as he was at the front of them. A quick glance to the Dothraki when he saw the arrows fly no more showed them to be making their way to ready for their charge, and though it was not something he did much of, he smirked happily at the sight. Before they could do so, however, he felt the chill in the air and moved back to the front of the line so that he could get a better view. There were more of them than he had expected, but he had expected them. Setempa Tali Morgon, Durogon, Zird Iagon. The White Ghosts, take them down. He shouted loudly, and short spears were handed to those who knew how best to use them. While behind him, some Dothraki now held their positions and lined up their shots. The Queen and Drogon picked that very moment to fly close to them and lay down their flames. Any dead unlucky enough to be in their direct path were simply eviscerated by them. Yet that was not truly his queen's intent, and this time, Grey Worm smiled far more truly in doing what she'd just done. His queen had lit the ground ablaze, and as the dead burned, their masters were now truly revealed to him. "Persiers! Fire!" he called out loudly. Behind him, the arrows were let loose first. They flew so low over his and his men's heads that Grey Worm felt the wind from them as they did so. He watched their flight with the aid of the light from the burning fires in front of him, saw them as some hit home, and some were dodged or blocked by the white ghosts who had realized the danger of their situation. They'd not be so lucky with the spears, he believed. As soon as the arrows had begun to strike their targets, the spears then flew. Most, if not all, seemed to land where they'd been aimed. One of two of them had been lit light and allowed an even more clear view of what they faced. Grey Worm now found to his dismay that there were still many more of the white ghost moving toward him and his men. "Persies, fire," he called out again and again. Arrows and spears flew through the air. These ones, though, were far less successful than the last. Knowing now that the true fight was upon them, he looked to his men and called out one more order. "Agrio se sambi orgaze sakogron." Spear and shield, hold the line. As one, his men did as they were bid, and behind him, the Dotri had now all departed. Replacing his spear with his short sword, he looked along his lines as more than one of his men did likewise. Then he waited for the white ghost to reach their lines, and tried not to think of those he was about to lose. For he was under no illusions that, unlike against the dead, to hold the line now would be far more costly. Again his queen and Drogon flew towards them. The loud roar of the black dragon reverberated through their lines and beyond. It filled his men with a resolve that nothing had ever come close to before. Not their training, their discipline, or their sheer will to win. Their faith in their queen was what truly brought them strength, and as Drogon loosed his flames on the white ghosts, he and the men with short swords charged forward. Some of their opponents were caught by surprise. The dragon's flames had landed close to them, and while they were unharmed by the fire, it had shielded Grey Worm and his men's movements from them. While a few had recovered more quickly and readied themselves to fight, those who had not had then fallen to a short sword, and behind them the dead fell too. Their swords were tinged with dragonglass. The smiths had somehow infused it into the metal itself. On the front of their small round shields a spike protruded that was as long as any dagger. It too was steel tinged with dragonglass, its tip almost made entirely of the dark and magical stone. The larger full shields that they used to make up their shield wall had many of those tips, the smaller round shields they used to fight one-on-one, only the one. As he now fought against one of the white ghosts, he did so using both the sword in his hand and the shield in his other. Grey Worm caring not which one would win him the day. As long as the day was won, his men didn't cheer when their opponent fell, for that was not their way. They simply moved on to the next opponent and began the fight anew, and that was exactly what he did when the white ghost fell. To the next one and the one after. As yet another fell. He looked to those with him, seeing more than he expected to be still standing, and yet fewer than he hoped, and he began to sense their victory was close. Taking down yet another white ghost, he heard a strange sound as he caught his breath. So he looked to see what seemed to be thousands of shapes moving across the open field. It took him some time to understand what it was he was looking at, then but a moment to order his men back to the lines. "Nejo, egrio se sumbi," to spear and shield, he called out for the Unsullied. Did not know a word for retreat. To his relief, his order was heard by one and all, and they made it back to their lines before the dead animals could reach them. He heard the sound of the larger shields being placed in front of them, and felt it as his men braced for the impact that the dead animals would soon bring to bear against them. Then once again he heard Drogon's roar, this time answered by two more. He looked on as all three dragons loosed their flames on the dead things below, and it was a glorious sight to see. Then he heard the thunder, as the horses began to ride, saw it as the arcs lit up, and the Dotri, along with knights led by Jon Connington, finally charged into the fray. "Noziard drin and Sajiakiar zir ia Noziard margon," to victory and glory, or to death, he said, repeating the words that he'd heard Jon Connington say. Ned Dane. Dawn swung and another dead thing fell, yet they still kept coming. Valyrian loosed his flames, and atop him, his wife never tired nor ceased her attacks, and yet they still kept coming. He could see the other two dragons in the distance. Drogon with the queen and Rhaegal and the king, Lightbringer in hand. And yet, they still kept coming. No matter how many fell, Their numbers appeared to be inexhaustible, and yet Ned was certain that was not true. So he looked for any sign that they were first having any effect at all, and second, were actually winning this fight. It took him a long time to see either the moments of respite, the pauses between when each wave of the dead attacked their lines, began to become longer, and it showed that they weren't facing an enemy of an infinite number. Then the winds blew and the air chilled, and he took it as a sign that they were winning. For up to now, the White Walkers had remained unseen. Looking along the lines, he could see that his men weren't the only ones ready for the new threat they were about to face. Jaime Lannister, Jon Connington, further down, Grey Worm, and Sarah Jorah Mormont. They'd faced this before, and so had most of those they led here today, as had his king and queen. So as it had been since he'd first met her, it was to Rhaenys that his eyes now turned. She, like some of the men of Dorne, had yet to face this threat, and he prayed that Aegon and his own words to her had been listened to. Seeing the first spear flying Bellyrion's way, he held his breath and then smiled when, as if it was nothing at all, the blue dragon simply dodged out of its way, as it did the next one that dared come near them, a loosing of a wave of flame. Later, and though the White Walker who had tried to take them from the sky would remain unharmed, the message sent by his wife would be heard loudly and clearly. Closing his eyes, Ned could almost hear the words spoken in Rhaenys' voice, as if he was atop Beleriand with her. "I fear you not." He opened his eyes to see the White Walkers were now in sight. Far more of them than he'd expected. Looking down the lines, he was happy to see that the best warriors amongst them now moved forward with their guards. It had been his own little contribution to the makeup of their army, and something that Ser Daemon had only been too happy to help with. Against a simple soldier, a White Walker was probably unmatched. Even against more than one, this was a truth they couldn't deny. They'd cut through their lines like a knife through butter, and then the dead would follow. Yet there had been men amongst their ranks who'd beaten them in the north. Jaime Lannister, Grey Worm, and Jorah Mormont were amongst them, and Ned knew that he was a better sword than any of them. He too had taken down one of the White Shadows, and he believed that Daemon was like to manage it too. So he'd sought out the very best sword, spear, axe, halberd, or Morningstar-wielding warrior amongst his ranks. He tested them, challenged them, and once he was certain, he'd armed them. Ned had placed guards with them to see to any dead that sought their ends while they sought the ends of their masters. Now, the truth or folly of all of that preparation was soon to be shown. So as the White Walkers closed the gap to their lines, his warriors for the dawn stepped forward. With a nod to Ser Daemon, Ned held Dawn in his hand and readied for the fight to come. Then he offered a small prayer that he, the knight who'd be his prince consort, and his men would one day laugh and jape and tell tall tales of this day. "For the princess," he shouted out, and though some would take it to mean Arianne, something clear by how firmly Daemon repeated his words, it was a different princess that he fought for here today. It took him no time at all to find himself in a fight to the death, Dawn's milky white blade against the icy one of the thing in front of him. There was something different about this, compared to the one he'd seen in Winterfell, something lesser to his eye. Where the one in the north was hauntingly beautiful in a way, this one was very much not. It seemed ugly to him, corrupted even more so than the other, and for some reason, that made his blows that much firmer. As skilled as the others it may well be, yet Ned felt he had its measure, something that he proved far more quickly than he expected after a simple dodge. Then parry, and finally, a thrust ended his opponent in an explosion of ice. Not waiting to congratulate himself on his victory, Ned quickly moved on to the next White Walker that he saw. A quick glance at the other fights that were taking place showed that all his efforts had not been for naught. The guards he'd given the warriors had done as he had wished for them to do. They fought off any dead thing that tried to interfere in the truer fight that was taking place, while the warriors themselves proved more than capable and up to the task he'd set them. After taking down his second White Walker, he saw 3 of them move to where Daemon stood alone. Hurrying to offer him aid, he was joined by a man of House Yerinwad who bore a morning star in his hands. 3 against 1 quickly became an even fight, and Ned took down his third White Walker of the day. There was no need for him to take down a 4th or a 5th, as Daemon and the man from House Yerinwood soon made light work of their own foes. "Is that it?" "I'd expected more," their new companion japed. "Your name, sir?" Daemon asked. "Rojain, Sir Daemon, and I'm no knight." "Not today. No. But should we see the morrow, then either by mine own hands, or I'd wager by Ned's, you'll not be able to say that then," Daemon said as he patted the older man on the back. Ned looked both at the 2 men he'd just fought with and at the field around him as they spoke. Some of his warriors had fallen, but it seemed as if most still lived. He saw no sign of White Walkers near him, and as he looked further down the field, he found he could see none there either. Yet he felt a tingling at the back of his mind, a call that begged him to get back to the lines. "We need to regroup, reform. We need a shield wall," he called out almost in a panic, though he knew not why he did so. "Ned, now Daemon," he shouted. Daemon rang in every man who had found themselves away from their lines, and facing a White Walker, now ran like cravens from the battlefield. What it must have looked like to their men, he knew not, but their shouts of shield wall were accepted and acted upon. As he took his place alongside his men, he both felt a fool and knew he was not. Yet it took some time for the reason for his panic to be made clear. Are those? As far as the eye could see, dead animals now made their way toward them. Animals of every sort, and they were a far different foe to face than any they'd faced thus far. Bracing for impact, the sound of the dragon's roars soon rang out, and he, Daemon, Ryon, and each and every man in their lines looked on as 3 dragons laid down their flames as one. It was a most welcome sight to see, and the sound they heard, but a moment later, almost drowned out the cheers that rang out across the entirety of their lines. Almost, but not quite. "The Dothraki have charged," he whispered happily. "Dany, it was different. It felt different to her. 3 dragons rather than 2 wasn't just easier because of the additional one, it was more than that. For some reason, it felt right. As if this was how it was meant to be." Akshonit had spoken to her many times about the true nature of war and why certain things were done a certain way in a battle. Over time, some things had just become what was done, while others that had been done previously now were not, he'd said. Or that was the basics of what he'd said anyway. Cavalry charges, besieging keeps, and even battles at sea had all developed in a set of tactical maneuvers that, if done correctly, would lead more often than not to victory. True enough, at times you were forced to adapt and work with what you had. A true military leader could still eke out a victory if they had fewer numbers, a worse strategic position, and were facing someone less skilled than they. But 2 equally matched forces, both led by leaders well-versed in tactic, that Aegon said was when it was left to fate, luck or gods to decide. And Bellico is not ready for what will bring him, Daddy. You, me, Rhaenys, he's not ready for that. As Drogon laid down his flames for the umpteenth time, while Rhaegal and Balerion did just as he did, Dany believed Aegon had known the truth of things, just as she believed that it had been more than a simple saying spoken by her family. She was now certain that 3 heads of the dragon was in fact the Targaryen's own gift to battle tactics. Looking to see where her good sister and husband were, she found herself surprised to see them flying towards her. For a moment she briefly felt a panic well up within her, but they were flying without any true urgency she was relieved to see. Then, for the first time since they'd taken flight this morning, afternoon, or evening, time not something that could truly be ascertained in a world with no sun, all 3 dragons were no more than a few feet from each other. She looked to her good sister, who was both looking her way and then at Aegon. Dany then turned to her husband, whose eyes were roaming over her, and Drogon, making sure she and her dragon were unhurt. Each of the 3 of them seemed most eager to know that the other was well and unharmed, and the relief she felt, once she knew they both were, was palpable. Looking to Aegon, she saw him point Lightbringer, and then Drogon and Balerion followed after Rhaegal in the direction they'd been shown. As one, all 3 dragons laid down their flames in unison, and it was a remarkable thing to see and take part in. The flames seemed to join together as one, and even when the dragons' heads began to move, their flames remained combined. For how long this went on, she knew not. After some time, Aegon pointed Lightbringer again, and both she and Rhaenys looked to see what it was he wished to show them. When she saw the animals charge, she knew the danger it would bring to her forces, and so, despite feeling that the 3 dragons doing as they had been was important, each of them now flew their separate ways once more. Soon enough, Drogon was laying his flames down in as wide an arc as possible, and once again, spears flew his and her way. It had only happened thrice so far since they'd taken to the sky today. Each time it was her son himself, and not her, who dodged the spears as they flew towards him, and this time was no different. Nuani Denka Tresi. My fierce son, she said as a way of praise, and felt him trill beneath her before he then went about his work once more. The cold winds blew, and she knew what they meant, as did Drogon. Glancing over her shoulder to make sure that Rhaegal and Balerion still flew safely, and that her husband and good sister were still unharmed. Dany smiled before then concentrating once more on making sure her army was as protected as much as she could make them. That had truly been the task that Aegon had set her and Rhaenys here today, to offer protection to their own sections of their forces from the dead that came their way. It was a lesson she'd learned well from the Battle of Winterfell, and a task she accepted without question when her husband assigned it to her. More so once she knew that just as she and Rhaenys, Aegon would mainly be doing the same. How long the battle had raged for, she knew not. Below her, she believed her army had suffered few true losses. The Dothraki had ridden and regrouped before riding again, just as they had at Winterfell. Dothraki and Balerion both offered them aid from above, should it be needed, while Rhaegal flew directly at their enemies' ranks at the same time. At what point she felt it, she knew not. The call came, and she and Rhaegal both answered it. For the first time that day, the battlefield was left behind, and all three dragons flew behind their enemies' ranks. Again, their flames were released in unison, and out of the corner of her eye she saw Lightbringer shine even more brightly. She believed she heard him in her head. The voice of her husband telling her that it was time, and turning to look at him, she felt her heart in her chest as what looked to be Lightbringer falling to the ground was revealed to be Aegon jumping from Rhaegal's back. Dany, Rhaenys, and the three dragons all looked on as the shining light from her husband's sword now moved along the ground beneath them. All the while they continued to loose their flames as one, and as she watched Lightbringer move in the air, a certain sign that Aegon was now engaged in a sword fight. So she now offered up a prayer to the old gods to bring her husband back safely. "Bring him back to me, back to our daughter. Bring him back, I beg of you." With that done, and though she wished for nothing more than to follow Aegon, Dany instead completely turned her attention to what she, Rhaenys, and the three dragons were doing. Beneath them, it wasn't flames that caught or fires that burned, but almost explosions of dead flesh and bone that brought about their enemies' ends. Not a single one of them was able to withstand the sheer power of three dragons' flames combined. They moved over the lines, and not even the White Walkers were able to withstand the force they were hit with. The flames may not have ended them as they did the lesser things under their and Bellico's thrall, but it did stop them from offering any aid to the fight she believed that Bellico was now engaged in, a fight against the man she loved, a fight for not just Aegon's life, but for all life, a fight that she believed would see her husband victorious once more. The Bloodstone Emperor. He sent them out and watched and waited. At first, with such arrogance that even as it became clear that he was losing this fight, he ignored it. All he could see was his army pushing forward and the one who stood against it not doing so. Little understanding that they were not, because that had never been their plan. When he first sent the spears to the sky to take down the dragons, he'd been certain they would easily complete the task. Yet he'd looked on as time and time again, the dragons had avoided them as if they were mere inconveniences to them and not the great threat that Bellico had believed them to be. As more and more of his army was defeated, he felt his power begin to drain from him. Reaching into himself to do some of the things he'd planned to do in this battle here today, he found himself unable to do so. The large winter storm he'd intended to bring chaos to his enemies' ranks had never been manifested, and now never would, and he understood it not. Why had he not led with that? Why had he sent wave after wave of his army against those that dared stand in his way? Was it hubris? Arrogance? Overconfidence? Had he made a mistake? Billy Cho fought down the voice that told him that he had indeed made a mistake. A huge one. He listened to it not when it told him that he'd fought this battle far too soon, that he should have waited and gathered more meat for his army, that he'd marched in the wrong direction and now faced a threat that could very well end him before he'd truly begun. He ignored that voice and listened instead to the other one in his head, the one that had always been there. The voice that told him that none could stand against him. When he sent the animals in, he did so with glee. Unlike the dead men and women he'd sent, they'd tear through his enemies' ranks. None could stop them, or him, or so he told himself. Yet again, he was proved wrong, and the dragons made easy work of the dead animals, just as they had the dead people he'd sent against them. Few, if any of them, even reached the enemy's lines. None broke through them, or threatened what lay behind them. And Bellico cursed them for their failure. Again the voice rang out in his head, and again he ignored the words that it spoke. Retreat, regroup, rebuild. He bid more spears aimed at the accursed dragons. Looked on as they once again failed to hit their mark. Knowing that dead things were of no use to him against dragonfire, he called for his generals and sent them into the fray. Smiling to himself, he waited for the inevitable victory that was soon to be his. Yet it never came, as they, just like the dead, failed him too. Worse than that, he felt it even more keenly when they fell. The loss of power when he'd lost dead things was that much more telling when that dead thing was a vessel he'd given some of his power to. He felt weaker, lesser, and for the first time, fearful. Yet again he ignored the voice that he heard in his head. You are losing. They are winning. He is winning. Your end is nigh. He'd not accept such words he could not. The victory was to be his. Essos was to be his. Planetos was to be his. Wasn't it? Hadn't he been promised it? He couldn't be beaten, could he? My destiny is to rule it all, he said as he quietened down the voice for now. When they came and flew over his lines, he was shocked. Seeing them so close and feeling the sheer power that resonated off them and more worryingly off of him. Even he had to shield his eyes somewhat from the light, and as the dragons laid down their flames, as one, Bellacho felt his panic threaten to overwhelm him. He called out for all those he had left to him, sent the remainder of his generals to the battle, with but two goals. Take down the dragons. Kill the bringer of light. It was too late when he realized his mistake. They were too far to come to his aid, when he called for them. The bringer of light was no longer atop a dragon. He was on the ground and he was coming for him. No, no, this will not be my end, he said as his dark sword took shape in his hands. As the light from the sword held in the dragon's hands lit up and began to shine, Bellacho finally listened to the voice in his head, though its words brought him no comfort at all. You win or you die. He knows that, and now so will you. Aegon! His attention was split between those he cared about and the fight itself. At various times during it, he'd look through ghost eyes to see how Reliap was. Egane took great comfort in seeing that those around his daughter had done their very best to make this seem like just another ordinary day. Missandei both told her stories and played games with her, while Tormund was acting like a fool, just to bring a smile to her face. Outside the tent, Lyriax watched with just as keen an eye as Aegon did. The Red Dragon was ever alert. Should the need for her to be called into action arise, he took comfort too in the men that he'd left as his daughter's guards. Not a single one of them slacking or not paying attention as far as he could see, and should they win this day, he'd find some way to thank them for their diligence. Leaving Ghost behind and thanking his truest friend for watching over his daughter, Aegon took flight in a small bird and found he was not the only one to do so. Lady Melora had many of them in the sky, almost too many to count. Her own 1,000 eyes and one were busy doing the same as he and were ever watchful. Once he knew that his daughter was in no danger and that her escape route was still clear, it was back to those who were truly in the fight that he looked to. These through Rhaegal's eyes, their lines had held firm under each attack that had been sent at it. Whites, or this version of them, dead animals, with the help of the dragons and the White Walkers, through the sheer doggedness and resolve of their best trained men. He both thanked the gods that some of these men had fought in the Battle of Winterfell, and so had faced such enemies before, and wished that neither they nor he had needed to face that battle at all. Taking one last look at their lines, he was happy to see far more faces that he recognized were still amongst the living than he had feared. As both he and Rakil joined with Drogon and Balerion and laid their flames down, he gave his wife and sister the signal that had been agreed between them. Though he couldn't truly see their faces, he did believe that he felt their relief that those they cared about were thus far unharmed. Once done, he readied himself to end this fight once and for all. All three of the dragons let loose their flames, as one yet again, they flew to Bellacho's lines, and he was happy to see the Dothraki charge and regroup in its effect. Just as in the Battle of Winterfell, his orders had been listened to, accepted, and followed to the letter. Now because of it, their victory was so close he could feel it. For Dany, for Rainsea, he called out as Raxley parted from his brothers and flew further behind Bellacho's lines. No more spears came his way, few arrows did. The three dragons acting as one had cleared the path to the Bloodstone Emperor, yet it was only he who could walk that path. Rosier didn't argue with him for once. His dragon knew the stakes, the plan, and though he'd not agreed with parts of it, he had accepted it. Partly Aegon believed because it was but one of many he'd made for the battle here today. contingencies upon contingencies. He'd come up with various different endgames depending on how the day went. This had been the one he'd hoped and prayed for. Rizzio cleared the path ahead and behind him. No dead thing would come out of the shadows and interfere in the fight that was soon to take place. Though his and his brother's flames had not truly harmed the White Walkers, they had dispersed them, and Bellico had become desperate enough by that point to have sent them all into the breach. It was a mistake that Aegon had no intent to allow him to recover from. One that if he had his way, would bring about his end. He spoke softly to his dragon, thanked him for all he'd done today, and promised him that this was not to be the last flight they shared together. Then with Lightbringer in hand and Rhaegal flying lower to the ground, Aegon jumped and Rhaegal turned to rejoin his brothers. One spear flew as he did so. Whether it was aimed at him or his dragon he knew not, but it found neither of them. Instead, it simply flew by them harmlessly, and Aegon turned his attention to the figure, some feet away from him, who'd thrown it. Gilly had told him much and little about Bellicose Aegon. He was thinner and fitter than most of the wealthy men in Essos, who for some reason usually ended up falling to fat. Others had named him as cunning and thoughtful, yet he was not a man who'd been well known for his military prowess. Looking at him now, Aegon would have to say that the self-styled Bloodstone Emperor was actually a disappointing sight. "This ends now," he said firmly as he moved towards the man who wished to enslave the word, Lightbringer, shining ever more brightly and more of Bellico's features coming into view. Where the Night King was blue, polished, pristine ice, Bellico seemed more like the blood-stained snow that Jon Snow had died upon. There was a dark red hue that almost looked black when Lightbringer wasn't completely illuminating him. His eyes were at once a blue and then a red, as they glared angrily at him, while his lips looked a deep purple to him as if they were both starved and yet filled with blood at the same time. The sword he held in his hand was blood red, yet it was made of ice, and it was Bellico who swung his sword first. Aegon parried it with Lightbringer, and then the fight truly began in earnest, though it was immediately clear to him that Bellico was no true swordsman. It was clear, too, that whatever power he tapped into had compensated for that greatly. Yet as they fought, he felt that power weakening considerably. It took him but a moment to realize why that was, and so he bid Rhaegal redouble his efforts with his brothers and to let loose both his flames and his roars. The more soldiers that they took from the Bloodstone Emperor, the more likely it was that Aegon would dine tonight with his family and not with the gods. Reluctant though it was, his dragon did as he was bid, and Aegon parried yet another blow. Time seemed too slow as the two swords clashed with neither of them truly winning this fight. Yet while Aegon still fought within himself, Bellico very much did not. A voice in his head told him to finish it, to press home his advantage, and yet he ignored it. Bellico was not the Night King. Their magic may be similar, but they were very different too. The last thing he wished to do was allow his eagerness for this to end to then lead to his own. So he paced himself, conserved his energy, and when Lightbringer began to shine and Bellico's blows seemed to weaken even further, then and only then did he press forward. It ended in an explosion of light. Lightbringer burned so brightly and intensely that Aegon would wager that its light could be seen, not just in Quhor, but all the way to Lorath and mayhap even Braavos. The blood-red sword didn't just break, it shattered, and the sound of 3 dragons roaring out in unison resounded for miles around. 2 swipes of the illuminated blade were all it took to end the man who had wished to own the world. One that took his arm at the shoulder and the other that slashed down his chest and allowed for a dark black stone to fall and crash against the ground. I can't lose my destiny. Those were the last words spoken by Bellico Stacano, and yet his death didn't bring the sun back or turn night back into day. Through Rhaegal's eyes, Aegon could see that no dead thing moved, and their victory was complete, and yet this now felt like a loss to him. It was then that he felt it. The darkness had not come from the man, though he had no doubt there had been evil in him. It came from the black stone that lay some feet away from Bellico's corpse. Moving to it, he felt it call out to him, beg him to embrace it, and he even believed he heard a voice offering him whatever it was his heart desired the most. There had been a time, many years earlier, when he would have had no idea what it was that his heart desired the most. To be named good and true by the man he'd thought a father. To be looked at as an honorable man who'd risen above the stain that his name had brought him. To know about his mother and whether or not she had loved or even cared for him. Now, though, he had what he desired most in the world. A family. Raising Lightbringer high, he brought it crashing down hard on the black stone. Then he both saw the light as the sun shone once more and the darkness as his eyes closed. Once again there was nothingness. No dreams, no sounds, no smells. Nothing but darkness. And he feared it far more now than he had the last time he'd known it. For who knows how long this was all he knew, and then he felt warm air brushing over his face and willed his eyes to open. Standing above him, Rhaegal looked at him with such concern and relief. He felt him in his mind, asking him if he was well, begging him to tell him that he was well. Rising to his feet, Aegon moved to the green dragon and placed his hand on his snout. He looked deeply into those bronze eyes and told him that he was unharmed. Once the dragon was sure that he was telling him the truth, Aegon sought first Ghost and then any other animal he could be certain that his family and friends were unharmed too. Above him, the sun shined. In his hand, Lightbringer shone no more. Once he knew that all was truly well in his own little world, he then set about making sure it was the same everywhere else. Taking a pouch from his hip, he emptied out the contents, which was some remaining food that he'd not eaten. Then he moved to the shattered black stone, and with his gloved hand he picked up each and every single piece of it. To its left, Bellico looked as if he was just another dead thing. There was nothing special or noteworthy about him whatsoever. With barely another glance at the man, he finished what he was doing, and then climbed up to take his place on Rhaegal's back. "Dracarys," he said, and the green dragon's flames soon burned away. Bellico's corpse. They took flight. Both of them were eager to show their family that they were unharmed. Though the light hurt his eyes somewhat, and he could see that those on the ground and his wife and sister would take far longer to readjust. Both he and the green dragon were clearly seen. Aegon heard the loud cheers as the dragons flew over their army. He chuckled to himself when his sister bid TARGERIYAN land so she could find her husband and make sure that he too would see another day. As for him and Dany, it was to Rhaella that his wife now flew, and he and Rhaegal followed. While Dany bid Drogon land, he had one more thing left to do. So after he'd seen his wife hold their daughter in her arms, after he'd allowed both Ghost and Lothrax to see he breathed still, and after shaking his head at Tormund, waving to him like the big fool he was, Aegon and Rhaegal flew on a little further. It took them some time to find the volcano, and even more to see the molten rock itself. With the pouch in hand, he emptied its contents into the burning fires, and once he was certain it was done, they then turned to head back. Costigan, Bisasagon, Simori Vili Basma, Elon, Mirialai Kuran, Nuharakiras. May this be the last war we ever face, my friend, he said, as Rhaegal roared out loudly in approval. Kur 3007 AC. Dany. The sound of laughter rang around the manse. And the Aegon carried Raxleal on his shoulders, and her daughter was pretending that her father was her dragon. The Daneslee could hear her willing Aegon go faster and fly higher, and even the sound of her voice was joyful. It had been this way for the past 2 days. From the moment that Raxleal had landed and Aegon had told her that not only was it done, but what he'd done with that accursed black stone too. Not that she truly understood the nature of it at the time, though both Kinvara and Melora had explained it more to her since then. Faster, Papa, faster. Rosier called out, and Dany was soon laughing herself, as despite the fact that this had been going on for an hour or more, Aegon showed no sign of tiring. In the end, it was she that brought their play to an end, reluctant though she was to do so. It was time for them to break their fast, and so, taking Raxleia from her husband's shoulders, and after promising their daughter that they'd fly on a real dragon at some point later today, something which earned her a pout from Aegon, as well as a mumbled, "I'm a real dragon," from his lips, Daneson fixed Raxley's clothing, and the three of them left the room and made their way to the larger one, where they'd take their meals. Even as they walked, Aegon was engaged in some game or other with their daughter. Dany offered him a mock-chiding look, and Aegon stuck his tongue out at her in response. In her arms, Rosial hid her head while Aegon would hide behind her and come at their daughter from the other side, and each time he did so, Rosial laughed even more. By the time they'd reached the room they'd headed to, Aegon had taken Rosial from her arms, and it was Dany herself who was hiding, and then reappearing where their daughter wouldn't expect. "See, I told you, little dragon, though she may deny it, your mother likes to play games too," Aegon said, earning him a sticking out of her own tongue. Missy and Lady Melora were already present, as was Grey Worm. Satyr Jorah, who'd been on duty at their door, was now bid to take a seat, and soon enough they were all sitting. Aegon continued to make up new games for Riel to play, and Dany was not alone at the table watching them both as they did so. That her husband made their daughter eat too was a welcome thing, as Riella was not one who enjoyed her morning meal usually. They took their time with their meal. Rosianne and Ed joined them near the end of it, along with Lady Kinvara and Jon Connington. Yet, when it ended, it seemed as if time had raced by, and both she and Aegon were reluctant to leave the table and do the work they needed to. Today they would take the vows of fealty from the great and the good of the city, something that had been offered to them long before they even had a chance to demand it. Though given they defeated an enemy that wished to enslave one and all and had turned night back into day, it wasn't too much of a surprise that it had been. "We should march on the city, Your Grace," Jon Connington said. "There will need not be any march, Lord Connington," Lady Melora answered. "There will not?" Aegon asked. "No, my prince. The Calhurics are no fools and will seek to kneel before being asked to do so." The lady had, as was most often with the things that Melora said, been proved right. A parley had been arranged not more than a day after they'd beaten Bellico and his army of dead things, one where the city was offered to them and a request was made to join the empire they were forging. Today that request would be granted, and Dainty found herself excited about that, yet wishing that both she and Aegon could just spend the rest of the day with their daughter too. Part of that was because of the fear both had before the battle. Aegon's had almost crippled him, and in a way, his fear had fought her own away. The idea that they'd not see their daughter again, or that one or both of them would fall and Rhaenyra would grow up as they had done, without a parent, had been one she'd done her best to fight away. Dany believed she'd been successful in doing so, as had Aegon, yet that fear would probably stay with them for the rest of their lives if she was being honest with herself, so it was partly that which made their time with Rhaenyra so precious to them both. Mainly, though, it was simply that they both enjoyed it so very much. "Go with Auntie, Missy, Rosier. Mama and I have much to do," Ygritte said eventually. "No, Papa, stay, Mama, stay," Rod said, crossing her arms and pouting. Before either she or Aegon could chide her for being somewhat of a brat, half-hearted as that chiding would no doubt be, Missandei moved to Rolla and whispered in her ear. Both she and Aegon looked on as the pout disappeared almost in an instant and was replaced by a smile followed by an eager nod. Missandei then lifted Rolla from Aegon's lap. Dainty looked on as first Aegon and then she was kissed on the cheek before Missandei nodded to her and walked from the room with 4 Unsullied as her escort and Rolla's guards. "Liara Hawks," she asked to a chuckle from Aegon. "What else? You and I are poor substitutes for her dragon, my love. Best we get used to it." She made conversation with Rhaenys and Kinvara, a little with Melora and some with Aegon too, but the meal was over and done with, and it was almost time for them to ready for the oath swearing. Rising to her feet, Aegon doing likewise, they made their way to where they knew Missandei had taken Rhaen Oths. And Dane smiled as Aegon's words were proved right. Their daughter, Ghost, and Lyax were all now at play together in the Garden of the Manse. More than 100 Unsullied and Sarbrienne guarded them. Not that they were in any true danger. With a last look at them all, she turned and walked back to their rooms. Once she reached them, she then began to change for the meeting. "Aegon," she chided, as she slapped his hand away from her breast. "The gods should not have made you so beautiful, my love," Aegon said as he let her go back to changing her clothing. "My husband is incorrigible," she laughed. He helped her fit her armor, while she then did the same with his own. The sight of her half-naked body had brought a wicked look to her husband's face, and she'd wager she'd worn the same one when he changed his breeches. For their meal and their play with Rhaenyra, they'd worn simple casual attire. For the meeting with the Curics, it would be anything but. Their best and most regal outfits, polished armor, and even their crowns. They would look exactly as they were. The Emperor and Empress of Essos and King and Queen of the 7 Kingdoms. Mirian Mantris, Court, Bravos, Volantis. Most of the major cities were already theirs. Few, if any, stood against them, and those that did so only because they'd not yet moved to take them. Some, she had no doubt, would come, as Koduri had, simply by word and not deed, while some would mayhap need to be given a different reason to kneel. Though kneel they would, a conquest that she'd expected would take far longer than it had already done, was reaching what was soon to be its end. Soon enough they'd be leaving the warm clime of Essos behind, and Dany wondered if Aegon was as eager as she to return to Westeros. "This will have to do," she heard Aegon say. and she turned to see him moving from the looking glass. It was just after midday that they arrived in the center of the city. She, Renzies, and Aegon were on their dragons' backs, while the Dothraki, Unsullied, Tiger Cloaks, and Men of Dorne arrived on foot or by horse. It was in truth a tiny part of their army, one so that each of them was represented and could bear witness to the oath swearing. As with Meereen and other cities now under their control, certain rules would apply here from now on, and as with them, some coin and goods would soon be making their way back to Westeros too. Climbing down off Drogon's back, Dany was joined by her good sister and her husband, Sir Jorah, Sir Jaime, Grey Worm, and Jon Connington, along with Tormund and the ladies Melora and Kinvara, all made up the party that walked to where seats had been laid out for them. The actual swearing of the oaths took little time, and Dany believed the words when they were spoken. Lady Kinvara had looked into the fires, and though Lady Melora had found her own answers from a different god, those answers were the same ones in the end. Quoha had knelt willingly and truly. There was no mummery going on here, and they had naught to worry about when it came to the oaths that were sworn. With that done, it was back to the manse, and back to Aegon playing with their daughter. This time, with Uncle Mund, as Tormund had become known to Rosiac. Once again, Dany looked on as her husband played the fool for their daughter, and once again she heard the sound of loud and true laughter as he did so. Took over 3 House 7, AC. Rosianes, a part of her had wanted nothing more than to stay in bed with her husband. Their time together had been one filled with one interruption after another, and now with the battle won and traveling soon to come, she'd wished for nothing more than some time where it was just them both. This morning, however, would not be that time, and so, after they'd woken and broken their fasts, Riches had joined her brother and good sister to fly to the parley. Crocoord and its people had managed to avoid the fate that Bellico wished for them only because of what she, Dany, and Aegon had done. Yet, Rhaenys still hadn't expected it to be as easy as it seemed to be to bring them to their side. There was no need for a battle to be fought, or even for threats to be made. Aegon and Dany hadn't even reached out to those who ran the city. Instead, it had been the other way around, and while she knew she shouldn't, she worried it was too easy, that there was some mummery taking place. Not even the words of Lady Melora and Lady Kinvara had been enough to convince her otherwise. So, she'd shared her concerns with her brother. Can it be so simple, Aegon? You distrust the cohorts. They by their nature are untrustworthy. Their rituals and beliefs are much different than those in most cities, even by Associ standards. And other than Ashe, they are the ones who give me the most pause, she said. Happy to see Axley as a listen, even if he seemed not to agree. I think seeing nightfall, knowing how close the two armies who fought the battle were to their gates, and even if they knew not the true nature of one, seeing the other be victorious would be enough to bring them to our side. Yet, in truth, I don't think it's even just simply that which has done so. You don't? She asked, confused. Oh, it played its part, but I believe Kilfear was ready to kneel long before the long night fell or the battle was fought. You know who they'd use to protect the city from those who sought to attack it? Aegon asked, and Rhaenys shook her head. Unsullied. You think because the Unsullied are with us? I think had Dany come here alone, then she'd have brought Cohort to its knees just by who she was and who followed her. As much as the battle, Bellico's defeat, or the fact the sun is back where it belongs, it's that they are kneeling for. Rosiers wasn't sure whether she agreed with her brother or not. She wondered if he was giving his wife too much credit. Then she remembered what had happened in Braavos and how the Sea Lord had knelt so very easily. While he'd had his own reasons for doing so, and the ending of slavery was something that drove him, it was to Dany more than to anyone else that he'd wished to kneel to too. Mayhap the Cohorts were the same, or mayhap it was more that they'd come so very close to suffering the same fate as the Norvosi. In the end, it mattered not. Later, as they flew over the city and headed to where the parley was to take place, Rhaenys felt relieved to see that even though Aegon expected no mummery, he was taking no chances that there may be one at play. As with the Triarchs and Volantis, the parley was to be held out in the open, and their escort was to be a large one. Dothraki, Unsullied, and men from Dorne and Braavos. Thousands of them lined the route and were spread out around the large central square where they'd be holding the discussions. Circling above the square not once, but twice, Rhaenys saw the white cloaks of Jaime Lannister and Jorah Mormont. She could make out Grey Worm and Cuno, Jon Connington, and finally, much to her delight, her husband too. At a nod from Aegon, all 3 dragons landed and the dragon guard was soon surrounding them. Ned took up a position behind her, and she could see Don's hilt over his shoulder. After offering him her warmest smile, they made their way to the chairs and large table and were greeted by the Kuhuriks. 4 men faced them. Not one of them younger than 50, named Isolde, she'd wager. These were the elders of the city. Men who were not quite magisters or treyarchs, and at least one of them was a high priest of some sort. Empress Daenerys, Emperor Aegon, Princess Rhaenys, we are most pleased that you've come to treat with us. Most pleased. The oldest of the man said before he then introduced himself and the other 3. Again, as it had been in Volantis, Aegon left it to Daenerys to set the terms for their entry into the Empire, an end to slavery. Though they'd not interfere with their religious beliefs, which was something the men seemed most pleased about. A percentage of their coin and supplies was to be sent to Westeros, and taxes were to be paid each and every year from now on. Again, this was something they accepted without question. The only issue that actually came up was when the agreement was asked to be witnessed by a blood bond. Why is there a need for such? Aegon asked. It is how things are done in Couchiar, my emperor. A simple bleeding into the bowl is all that we require. And the blood, what happens to the blood after? She asked, and then shook her head when she was told that it would be stored in one of the temples. Rhaenys moved and whispered in Aegon's ear, her brother's eyes on the 4 Kovawiks in front of them, and their eyes on both her and Aegon. When she was finished, she saw Aegon nod to her, and then he bid her to inform them of their decision. We will agree to the bloodletting, but not the storage of said blood. Dragon blood is precious and not something we share, not our own, nor that of the dragons themselves. Lady Kinvara, if you'd be so good as to take charge. Though it was clear they liked it not, the Kolruks raised no objection, and after the 4 men had cut their palms and let their blood pool in the bowl, it was their turn. Rogius took the small knife she carried and cut her palm, allowing the blood to drip into the bowl before Ned moved forward and handed her a handkerchief to bind the wound. Aegon and Dany then did the same, and once their blood had pooled into the bowl, she bid Kinvara to offer it to the flames. All eyes turned to the Red Priestess as she walked to where Drogon awaited before laying down the bowl in front of the Black Dragon. Once she did so, Kinvara moved from it quickly, and then Dany turned her head to look at Drogon. Dracarys, she said, as now all eyes looked to the Black Dragon and the bowl of blood that lay on the ground in front of him. It was barely a flame at all that Drogon let out. Rhaenys unsure how he was able to manage to produce one that was so small. Not that it lacked in intensity, as even from some distance away, she could see the bowl melt and then the flame caught the blood itself. Other than Wildfire or Lightbringer, she'd rarely seen something so bright as she then did. Around them, their guards, the Koasariks, and even Kinvara had to cover her eyes. Yet she, Aegon, and Dany did not. She'd later name it one of the most wondrous sights she'd ever seen. For the merest moment, she was sure she saw a woman that could very well be her mother, and a man who she'd name as her father. Her Aunt Shira was certainly seen by her. Briefly, she saw a young man who she believed was her fallen brother, Aegon. As the light dimmed, she looked at her still living brother and saw that he too seemed to have seen something similar in the light. As did Dany too. EJ, me too, we'll speak of it later, not here, her brother said, and she nodded. Eventually the light went out completely and there was no sign of the blood or the bowl. Was it not for the odd look on the Koasariks' faces, that and the way that they seemed even more referential in their words afterward, then she may have worried they'd managed to do some trickery and steal the blood somehow. Yet she knew in her heart that the bowl and the blood were gone. Whatever it was she, Ackland, and Dany had seen, had been for them and them alone. The parley ended not long afterward. Daenor had given the rule of the city to 3 of the 4 men opposite, and, in truth, little would actually change in Kosha from a practical standpoint. If anything, their joining the Empire would make them safer from attack. Not to mention that the cost they'd pay in terms of coin and food was, or would be, lesser than the tribute that they paid to Dothraki Khals in the past. Slavery was banned, and they answered to them above all. Other than that, the city would run as independently as ever. Later that night, as she readied herself for the celebrations to come, she found her thoughts turning to what she had seen in the light. Aegon and Dany had spoken, and like her brother had seen their brother, and though he'd seen his own mother instead of hers, and their granduncle Aemon instead of Shiera, she welcomed sharing as much of the vision with him as he did her. Dany had seen her mother, both her brothers and their granduncle too, and all three of them had thanked the gods for gifting them so. "Are you ready, my love?" Ned said as he moved behind her. Rosie smiling at his reflection in the looking glass to let him know she was. "Come, tonight is a night for celebration," she said, and though in the end she and Ned left earlier than most, it was a night she enjoyed immensely all the same. Storm's End 307 AC. Sansa Baratheon, a woman wedded and bedded. For the first time she actually found she liked those words. Sansa felt she deserved the chance to feel some joy at them, given all she'd gone through. Her wedding night had been so very different from her last. She'd been nervous and worried, and had trembled as she'd undressed. After she'd done so, and he'd held her and spoken softly in her ear, Edric had then brought her far more pleasure than she had expected. He'd been angered when he saw her scars, not at her, but at the monster who'd given her them, and the cruelty of the world which had allowed it to be done. Even now, days later, Sansa remembered how he'd sworn if Ramsay was alive that he'd have ignored everything else he wished for just to see the man suffer. He'd then, much to her surprise, kissed each and every one of them, and it had made her cry as she lay in his arms. It had since then been Sansa and not he who had initiated their coupling. Eager as Edric clearly had been for it, he'd let her somewhat take the lead, or he did until he took control. Looking at her husband now as he slept in their bed, Sansa smiled as she remembered their first night together, and the nights they'd shared since. She'd felt wicked and wanton as she'd whispered in her husband's ear that mayhap they should take an early night, the night after they'd been wed. They'd then hurried back to their rooms, and once again found great pleasure with each other. This was even more true when after seeing him spar, she'd given him a look and made her way back to their rooms and he'd joined her. Their lovemaking was just as loud and enjoyable during the day as it had been at night. "My wife has worn me out. Is that not my duty, husband?" "Indeed, I'd not have it be duty only, Sansa. It's very much not, husband mine." She smiled even now as she thought back to how they'd speak after they'd exhausted themselves with one another. Moving from the bed, Sansa dressed quietly, and once she then moved back to place a soft kiss on Edric's lips. Her husband was a heavy sleeper of a morn while she found herself waking early. With a last longing look at him as she walked from the room, Sansa sought out the little bird and readied for the mummery she was about to perform. While she welcomed finding such delight in her husband's touches and caresses, she knew it created a problem for her. She'd come here ostensibly to perform a mummery so that she could gain her bastard cousin and his whore of a wife's favor. Sansa had been more than willing to sell Edric out so that she could get back that which was stolen from her. Now she was very much not. Yet she had no doubt that Varys had learned not just of the wedding, but of how enthusiastic she'd been about the wedding night itself. Not even the words she'd sent him in letters declaring it all an act would be enough. He'd know too about their plans, or some of them at least. So it was time to throw him off the scent. It took her some time to find the little girl, and when she did, Sansa bid her to join her in her husband's solar. Taking a seat once inside, she took a quill and some parchment and wrote out the note. There was no point in trying to sell the gathering of men as anything it was not, nor to deny that she'd called out her husband's name in pleasure more than once. So she did not. Instead, she sold the latter as a needed thing, and the former as what it was, just not what it truly was. "Lord Varys, my efforts to gain Lord Edric's favor have proved more than successful. So much so that he asked and I consented to be his wife. Even though I had and have no wish to ever be tied to a man not of my choosing ever again. In my desire to prove myself trustworthy, I have played a dutiful wife, even though the things we do together are things that have long lost any desire or interest on my part. Yet we do what we must, and I'll not lie and say that I've not found some pleasure in my husband's touches. Much to my dismay, though that may be, I write to you to confirm my resolve and to share with you what my endeavors have achieved. My husband seeks more than what he has, Lord Varys. He is not as loyal to the new king and queen as he may suggest he is, and has gathered an army to begin to take these lands from them and for himself. Much to my shame and horror, it is mine own words that have given him his first target, and though I long to warn my sister of the coming storm, I fear my words would not arrive nor even be allowed to be sent. It is to the north we sail, Lord Varys, to the north and to Winterfell. As my husband seeks to right a wrong I no longer consider one. I hope you can do what I cannot, and inform my sister of the threat and their graces of my good intent. I await eagerly any instructions you can send my way. My penance is far from complete, Lord Phyllis, but I walk a path that I hope leads to some forgiveness. Sansa Stark. She blew on the ink and waited until it was dry before sealing the letter and handing it some coins and some candied fruit to the little girl who smiled at her as she hungrily ate it. Waiting until she had left the room, Sansa was soon walking back into her bedroom, and the sound of her footsteps was enough to wake Edric from his slumber. "You've sent the letter?" he asked, and she nodded as she undid the straps of her dress. "I'm ever so repentant," she said, with a girlish giggle. "Has my wife been a naughty girl?" "Very naughty, husband," she said as the dress fell to the floor, and she stood in front of her husband naked. "Then we shall have to reprimand her most severely." Most severely indeed. There was no reprimand, though she did receive quite a thorough tongue-lashing, and it was one that soon had her screaming her husband's name loudly, as did the coupling that came after it. Be it that he'd once again managed to inflame her desires so completely, or that she was so very close to getting all she deserved, she knew not. All she knew was that they would soon be sailing for King's Landing, while all eyes looked north. That, and by the time Varys and the rest of them realized her true intent, they'd be in no position to do anything about it. A week later, the response from Varys had been even better than she or Edric had hoped for. He'd completely bought into her lie and had sent word to Arya to prepare for an attack. Even better than that, he'd sent men north to offer them aid to prevent that attack, making King's Landing even less protected. So excited did the news make her that, after she'd shared it with Edric in his solar, he'd taken her on top of the table rather than in their bed. She'd willed him to, begged him to, and he'd done as she wished. The two of them fell over the edge together, and it was not the last time that they did so that night. Now they were to march, and when she'd asked for leave to march with him, Sansa had feared he'd not allow it. She'd bitten her lip nervously as Edric contemplated her request before kissing him deeply when he'd agreed to it. A part of her had feared she'd be asked to stay in Storm's End or be told that a battlefield was no place for a woman to be. In her head, she'd readied her arguments that would name that thinking as folly. Sansa had known what it was like to be on a battlefield. She'd ridden to one as they had marched to take Winterfell back. Had she not done so then, they'd have never seen the inside of her family keep ever again. It had been her actions that won the Battle of the Bastards, and while she believed that Edric was far more capable than her bastard cousin had been, she wished to be by his side and to offer any counsel she could. More than that, she simply wished to be by his side, not just so she could revel in their victory together, or get right to work in bringing the realm to their side once they had taken King's Landing. Sansa wished to be by her husband's side, and in his bed, to feel his arms around her and to enjoy the comfort and pleasure that the things they did together brought her. After we take the city, when the realm has come to our side, we'll deal with Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen. Sansa, we'll deal with them most severely indeed. We will, Edric, she smiled, as they left Storm's End behind and rode to where the ships awaited to ferry half their army to King's Landing. The other half rode there to take part in their two-pronged attack. Winterfell 37 AC, Arya Stark. As she sat at her desk in what had once been her father's solar and was now hers, Arya looked over the books and contemplated her first few moons as Lady of Winterfell. She'd asked Ed to stay on while she got settled and had sent men to the Dreadfort in his stead. The duties of a lady in Warden were many and numerous, and a part of her wished the dour former Night's Watch Lord Commander could stay on permanently. Yet she'd not deny him what Jon had given him, nor did she feel he'd not earned it. Still, she welcomed having the man around to help her during those first few weeks, and was sad to see him leave when the time finally came to do so. The Dreadfort and the lands around it should provide a decent income according to what my brother says. The coin he's given me is too much, my lady. No, it's not, Ed. You have men to outfit, stocks and supplies you'll need to purchase, and mayhap even changes you and your good lady wife will seek to make. Best you already have a treasury to do so with. You're probably in the right of it. I've no doubt we'll both be visited by my brother soon enough, and any supplies he sends you'll see your fair share of. On his behalf and mine own, I thank you for what you've done here, Ed. I'd have been lost these past few weeks had you not stayed and helped. Her words had embarrassed the man a little and made his wife even prouder of him. He'd left with half the men he'd put into positions around Winterfell. Only 2 of the former brothers of the Night's Watch chose to stay in her service rather than join him at his new keep. They only did so because they were in the midst of courting some girls from Wintertown and had not yet wed, while the others already had or were still single. Gendry looked after the forge himself, though to his annoyance she'd not allow him to work in it, other than on the odd occasion. So, it was more as a way of relieving the tension of being a lord than as a permanent job that his time there was confined to. Still, it allowed them to quickly replace the former smith who'd left with Ed. Ed himself helped fill some of the other positions that his and his men's leaving caused, while Arya soon filled the rest relatively easily. The Hound was captain of her guards, and she'd left it to him to see that Winterfell was safe and secure. They now had a small cavalry force of 100 men and a standing guard of close to 1,000. Her aim was to double or even treble that, but it would take a year or more to see that done. Not only did they have to find the right men, but Arya wished to see a full year's expenses and income before pushing too far too soon. Unlike her sister, Arya understood the true value of coin, and while they were far from short of it, and Jon had sent much of it their way, she'd not be a spendthrift, for winter was always coming. "My wife looks lost in thought," she heard Gendry call out, and the soft gurgling of Robb in his arms brought a smile to her face. "Give him here," she said, rising to her feet, and taking her son from her husband. Her son had grown much these past few moons. It was another moon or so until his first name day, and yet he was as large as a boy, twice as old. His dark hair was now growing full on his head, and she'd even considered having it cut. Not that she could have ever truly followed through with it. Robb's blue eyes were ever alert, and they brightened up when they looked into her own gray ones. As for the smile on his face, that was his father's through and through. While most people said he looked like her, to Argier, he was, and always would be, Gendry's son in looks alone. "My sweet boy," she said, as Robb gurgled, laughed, and reached out to grab her hair. "I told you that you should cut it," Gendry said when Arya grimaced as Robb managed to tug hard on a long strand of her hair. "I never listen to anything you tell me. I thought you knew that by now," she said, sticking her tongue out at her husband and making him and Robb both laugh the self-same laugh. For the next hour or more, they simply enjoyed being a family together. Had it not been for Robb's hunger, then she'd have been content with that being most of her day. Yet as she took a seat and bared her breast so her son could eat, she knew he'd soon be sleeping, and she still had more work to do. In this she was proved as right as always, as once her son had eaten and been winded, he began to doze off. But Gendry was the one who placed him in his crib, and it left Arya to go back to her work. Bored looking at numbers, she instead decided to do the rest of her thinking. Walking. Her footsteps took her to their granary and their stores, and the sight she was greeted in each was a welcome one. Arya remembered coming here as a young girl and wondering why there was a need for so much food. It always seemed as if they had a never-ending supply of it to her young mind. Now she knew better, and they could always do with having more. For it was not just the people of Winterfell or Wintertown that it fell to them to feed, but those of the north too. From the stores, it was to the stables, armory, and eventually the sparring yard that Arya walked to. Each place was as busy as the one she'd just left. Horses were being fed, and a brief question to the stable master was all it took to find out just how well stocked they were in hay and feed. They had enough arms to outfit twice the number of men, and more was being produced daily. By the time she was done, they'd have enough to outfit the entire army that Winterfell would have to call upon, and more. In the sparring yards, Sandor put men through their paces, and there was no stricter taskmaster than he. Arya stood a little out of sight and listened as he guided, berated, and even painfully taught a lesson to the men he trained. "I'll stick that fucking pike up your arse if you use it like that again. No, hold the fucking shield up, lest you want your fucking bell rung." "What did I say?" Hurts, doesn't it? That's why you hold the fucking shield to block the strike." She chuckled as she walked away. Eager as she was herself to have a true spar or join in, she knew she could not. Unless she was putting on a show of sorts, she kept her own training to early mornings and late in the evening, and did so far from prying eyes. Walking back into the keep, she welcomed the warmth it offered. Winter had been mild this year, and even looked to be coming to an end much sooner than the maester had believed. It was still winter, though, and her time in Essos had made her much appreciate the warmth of the sun. Arya made her way back to her solar, passing her rooms and entering to check up on Robb as she did so. Her son slept as peacefully as he could, and she smiled to see his wolf curled up on the floor beside his crib. Placing a soft kiss on his forehead and nodding to his nurse and his guards as she left the room, she was soon smiling truly as she saw her own wolf waiting for her outside her door. "You're back," she said happily as she rubbed her hand in Nymeria's fur. "I missed you so much, girl." Arziel's laugh rang out as she felt Nymeria's tongue lick her hand. Together they walked into the room and to her solar. Taking her seat at her desk, She brushed her hand through Nymeria's fur once more. Her wolf would from time to time disappear, and go and do whatever it was that wolves do. She'd always return, though, and no matter Arya's spirits, when she did, that return would always raise them higher. "Well, let's finish this, and then we can eat." "A girl," she said as she opened the books one more time and went about her day. Yukor 3007 AC. Ivyon. Taking the oaths of fealty and welcoming the Kioritz into their new empire was a welcome thing, and yet it bored him greatly. Not that he wished for another fight, or sought one out. Far from it, but more that he knew there were other more fun things he could be doing than this. So he was glad it was over and they could concentrate on the true celebration they were all owed. Ever since he'd ended Bellico, Aegon had felt a lightness that he wished to share with as many people as possible. It was why he played even more regularly and longer with Rhaegal than he had, though he had to admit that was something he wished to do regardless. As the celebration truly took place, Aegon laughed, drank, made a fool of himself, and even put Tormund to shame with some of his antics. His wife rolled her eyes each time he looked her way, and yet he soon had her dancing with him and laughing just as loudly and idiotically as he himself was. His sister too joined in fully, as Aegon's mood proved to be contagious. They had come here to take back the Bay of Dragons and free a people from slavery. Over time they'd realized that to do so, they needed to forge an empire that one day Rhaella would rule over. It had then become something different, something even more important than that. Another fight for the ages and another fight where they had come out victorious. He was right, and they were right to be fools this night. "Aegon?" Dany asked, and he just kissed her and laughed once again. "No questions tonight, my love. Let's get drunk and make merry for once." "What say you?" "For once," she smiled. Over the course of the night, Aegon spent time with Tormundad, Princess Arianne, her mother, and Ser Daemon Sand. He and Jaime sat, spoke, and drank together. The knight reluctantly agreed to take a night off when he'd bid him to. He'd laughed and japed with his sister and his wife, and had even snuck away to spend some time with his daughter. All in all, it was one of the very best nights he'd ever known, and he should have realized that it wasn't just good cheer or to celebrate a victory that he had been allowed to know it. Waking up the next morning, his head thumped, and his wife took great pleasure in giving him an "I told you so" look. It took him a few hours to restore any semblance of normality to his thinking, and that only came after he, Rhaegal, and Lyarhax took a flight over his city. Something which at first, even during it, was hard for him to truly enjoy. Rhaegal's laughter, Rhaegal's trills, and Lyarhax's calling out to her future rider all sounded far louder in his pained head than Aegon would have liked, until finally they sounded as welcoming as they ever did, and he could relax once more. "Rax, Papa," Rax said, as they landed and he looked to the Red Dragon to see that she wished for he ride her to sit on her back once more. "No fly, Rhaegat." "No fly, Papa," his daughter said with a nod, and Aegon felt the relief that her words brought him. Some time ago, he'd made the mistake of placing her on the Red Dragon's back before he or her mother had taken her for a flight on their own dragon. It was a mistake he'd never make again, as the Red Dragon had almost taken off before he could stop her. How long it would be until Rhaella took her first true flight on her dragon's back, he knew not. It would, however, not be today. Of that he was certain. The sound of the Red Dragon's trill and how Rhaella instinctively knew where to hold on to was heartwarming to see and listen to. From the balcony above them, Daenerys looked on and wore one of her truest smiles, and Aegon felt as content as he ever was. After a short while, he lifted Rhaella from Lyarhax's back and said goodbye to the Red Dragon for now. "Bye-bye, Rhaex," Rhaella said almost sadly, and it took all his resolve to bid Lyarhax to fly to her brothers. With the Red Dragon now in the sky, Aegon carried his daughter into the manse and to her mother, who awaited her with open arms. As always, he stood there listening eagerly as Rhaenyra told her mother about her morning flight in her own imitable way. Some mornings it would be he now holding her and listening to the tale, and on others, they'd have both flown with her. Those he'd wager were his favorite of all. He, Dany, and their daughter, the three dragons. Other than Ghost, their own family within a family. They broke their fast, and Missandei took Roxala to her first lesson of the day. It wasn't a true one, and what it entailed, Aegon knew not. Yet both his wife and her closest friend believed it benefited Roxala, and who was he to argue with either of them? With their meal done with, they now had to turn their thoughts to where they would go from here, and while he wished they could enjoy just sitting around and doing little, it was not yet the life they knew. So they left the room where they broke their fast and were soon in the one they'd taken for their solar. Rhaenys is coming? He asked. Dainty, who nodded. They were joined by Rhaenys and Ned by Lady Kinvara and Ser Jorah. Then after some time, Grey Worm, Jaime Tormund, and the leader of the Tiger Cloaks, a now-freed slave named Nurno, made their way to join them too. Looking at the maps, you could see where they had dragon figures placed. Meereen, Yunkai, and Astapor, the entire Bay of Dragons, Korth, Mantares, Volantis, and Bravos. They controlled almost all the major cities, barring a few, and their empire stretched from the Great Grass Sea to the narrow and shivering ones. The three daughters, Rhaenys said, pointing to Myr, and yet Aegon found himself looking to Lorath for some reason. Do we seek it all, your grace? Jaime asked, and Exton looked to Dany, who nodded. In time, Sir Jaime. Other than the three daughters, it's Ibn, Pentos, and Lorith. I'd look to Lorith next, he said, pointing to the city. That would take us past Norvos, would it not? Dany asked, and Aegon nodded. What do we expect to find there, Egg? Rosiernes asked, and Aegon sighed. Glad though he was that Princess Arianne and her mother were no longer truly in their war council, as both would be heading back to Dorne soon enough, and neither needed to hear what had happened to a city that both had named home once. Nothing good if what Lady Kinvara says is true, he said, all eyes then turning to the Red Priestess. Those we fought were mainly made up from there, other than some travelers who've taken shelter in the now abandoned city. There is no living thing there. Are there more of the dead? Tormund asked worriedly. No, the dead will trouble us no more, he answered before Kinvara could. Lord Tareth, it is then, Dany said. Just as Lady Melora walked into the room, and Aegon felt his heart drop at the look on the woman's face. What's happened? Your sister, my prince. It seems she seeks one final battle. Later that night, he lay awake in his Ike in Dany's bed. Beside him, his wife slept, and they talked out all they needed to. A part of him had known it would come to this, that by not taking her head, she'd never accepted that he'd done her a service and given her a chance. Sansa would never agree to a life lesser than the one she believed she deserved. Deep down, he knew and had always known that, as much as he may have believed that by sentencing her to live that lesser life he was punishing her, in truth, he was simply avoiding the only choice he could make in regard to Sansa. No more would he do so. No more would he be able to avoid that truth, and he cursed her for what she was now forcing him to do. Lady Melora said that he was not needed, though she'd said it to him alone. Aegon, though, couldn't allow them to fight without him. They couldn't be seen to fight without him, even should they win as easily as Lady Melora believed they would. No, it had to be seen to be the dragons who won this particular battle and put down this stupid rebellion. It had to be seen to be him that put Sansa down for good. And he hated her for not just that, but for taking him from his family in order to see it done. Damn you, Sansa. Damn you to the seven hells, he said as he rose from his bed and made ready for the flight he'd be taken when morning came. King's Landing, 3007 AC. Devas Seaworth. He was doing it again, old habits proving as hard to break as ever. It may not quite be the night before the battle, yet he found himself walking the parapets of the Red Keep regardless. The ships had set sail from the Stormlands. The army had marched, Edric Baratheon doing his utmost to replicate Stannis' attack plan. Fool that he was. Had he not realized that Stannis lost? Did he not understand that they'd be more prepared? Was he fool enough to believe they'd be caught unawares? The answer to two of those questions was that he did not. As for the third, his actions had already proved him to be a fool. Davos wondered if it was a Baratheon trait, if they simply saw what they wanted and believed it to be the truth. Robert had believed himself the hero in some tale, and had then proved himself to be the villain. He'd convinced himself of a love that was never his, and while that alone wasn't what led to the rebellion, it had been the truth that Robert had convinced himself. Rosierly believed that, because he was charming and people laughed at his japes, that alone was enough to make him the best man to wear a crown. He'd convinced himself that he was right to usurp his brother's claim, and to fight against rather than join him. Then he'd thought that feasting, hosting silly events that were little more than mock tourneys, and not marching on those who stood in his way of said crown, was how a war was fought. As for Stannis' Davos side, your belief was the most foolish of all, he said to the night sky. His words lost in the breeze that blew in from Blackwater Bay, Stannis had allowed himself to believe that he was some prophesized prince, even above his right or duty to be king. He was destined for it, or so he'd convinced himself. No, That wasn't quite true, Davos thought. She'd convinced him. It had led him on a path that Davos was shamed to say he'd followed him on. Images of blue eyes and her smiling face came to his mind, and he cursed himself for his part in the events that had led to her death. As he always did, turning to walk back inside the keep, Davos's thoughts turned to the latest fool, Baratheon, and wondered if Edric was to be the last of his line. There was no other outcome for him than death. No other sentence could be imposed on him but the truest one of all. Pushing the thought from his mind, he soon found himself walking in no particular direction. Eventually, he stood in front of the door and knocked, Varys opening it and bidding him enter. "You can't sleep either," Varys said as he poured them both some wine. "I find it hard to do on the eve of battle." "Not quite the eve, but I take your point," Varys said as Davos took a seat. The two men sat in silence for a few moments, both sipping rather than drinking the wine. When he did speak, Davos was surprised, and yet not by what he asked. "How's Baratheon, Varys? Other than Gendry is there. Maya Stone and Bella Rivers," Varys said, surprising him. "The Vale and Riverlands?" he asked. "Oh, he had many more than that. Among the many crimes of Joffrey Waters, kinslaying was but one of them," Varys said, and Davos gulped. "How many?" "I knew of 8, yet in total I believe it was 6 and 10. "And only 4 Lystil?" Davos asked, trying not to concentrate on the 2, and 10 that Joffrey Waters had ordered to be murdered. "Indeed, though for our purposes only 1 is of consequence." Varys, Maya Stone, Davos. Not only is she the oldest and so the heir after Edric is dealt with, but she spent some time around lords, ladies, and courts. While she has little education and spent her life working as a guide in the Vale, she's a bright enough girl and with the right guidance and husband, one that would do well serving our king and queen. "You've given this much thought," he said, surprised. "I wanted to have the arrangements made and to be certain they were needed before I brought it to you or their graces." "And have you?" he asked curiously. "The lady is aware that we seek her to become the lady of a great house and is more than pleased with the idea. Her station in life has taken much from her and shown her the truth of the world we live in. The truth of her birth costing her a love that could never be," Varys said. The last words spoken somewhat sadly. "Where is she now?" "Safe and well, and to be escorted to us once this dirty business is taken care of." But Davos chuckled. He'd heard war and battle called many things. Never a dirty business. Yet it was and always had been, and there were few more apt ways of putting it. "I should at least try and get some rest," he said to a nod from Varys. Finishing his wine in one swallow, he rose to his feet and was almost at the door when the eunuch spoke. "This is not a battle we will lose, Davos. Not one we should be forced to wage, but not one we'll lose." "I know, I had but hoped I'd fought my last one." Sleep did come to him, a little of it anyway. He woke the next morning to find that it would be one more day before the army that Edric Baratheon and Sansa Stark had gathered would arrive. As he was breaking his fast, he was joined by Varys, who handed him the letter that had been passed to one of his little birds by Sansa Stark. Reading it, he felt his anger grow at the mummery she would have them believe she was engaging in. Somehow he held his tongue, and it wasn't until he and Varys made their way to look over the defenses that he spoke what was on his mind. "Does she take us for fools?" he said angrily. "She does. More so's the pity." "What?" "If she did not, then she could have earned herself some favor back. Not enough to be given even half of what she wished for, but mayhap enough to be given far more than she has. She signed her own death warrant. Davos, there can be no mercy given to her now." "No, there cannot," he said, running his hand through his graying hair as he wondered how his king would greet the news of her death. He knew this was to be her end, Davos. You know, he knew. "Aye, he did," he said, though he liked it not. They walked around the Red Keep together. Everywhere they looked, there were soldiers. Some of them were more on duty than others. The city watch had been joined by more than 2,000 men at arms from the west. Men who'd looked to any as just more guardsmen and yet were very much not. Varys had found all the spies that Edric had left in the city, and the messages they now passed on were written not by them, but by the Master of Whisperers. Those messages promised an easy victory, and that was the last thing that Edric would find when he arrived here. With the Red Keep's defenses settled in his mind, Davos bid farewell for now to Varys, and along with his guards, he made his way through the city. They had men stationed on top of some of the buildings that led to the Red Keep and to other important parts of the city. Archers and crossbowmen, one and all, and just looking up at them, Davos shuddered. Any who were unlucky enough to make it this far would find themselves in a world of hurt. for there was little cover to be found on the ground, and the men stationed on the roofs would have a clear view of all below them. Arriving at the docks, he looked to the former Tyrell warehouse. The remaining men of the Golden Company were there under the command of Laxana Mar and Black Balak. More than 3,000 of them had come from the keeps they'd gifted them. All of them were eager to prove their worth to the king and queen they'd sworn to. Davos would match them against twice the number of any army other than the king and queen's own. Only the Unsullied and Dothraki were as experienced in war as these men and the men of the Storm would be. No match for them. "We ride to the King's Wood," he said, once he was happy enough with what he'd seen. He contemplated on Sansa Stark as he rode. Her letter named her as good and true, and warned them of an attack not where it was to take place, but far from their shores. A misdirection and feint that only a fool would believe they'd fall for. It annoyed him, angered him, and disturbed him in equal measure. Devamuse cared not for the girl, for she'd proved her true character not just from the moment they'd first arrived best in the north with the queen, but in the days, weeks, moons, and years that followed. There was no love in his heart for Edric Storm, either, as he too was just as big a fool as Sansa Stark had proved to be. No, his sympathy lay with the brother who'd have to be informed of her death and with the men of the Storm, some of whom he'd named as friends once. They should know better, should be better. Yet, once again they were reaching for something they didn't deserve and had no right to. This time, he felt that they would reap the whirlwind both on the battlefield and off of it. Entering the King's Wood, they'd ridden for no more than a few moments before they were surrounded. Some of Sir Davon's men of the West then escorted them to where the man himself had set up his camp. 15,000 men were under Sir Davon's command, 7,000 of them Knights of the Vale, who'd come when Lady Anya had called for them and were being led by her son. They had 10,000 mounted men, 500 archers, and over 4,000 infantrymen. Added to the forces they had in the city itself, their army was close to 30,000 strong, twice or even more the size of Edric's, and unlike his, they had the element of surprise too. "Lord Davos," Sir Davon said as Davos climbed down off his horse. "Sir Davon, what news?" Later that night, Davos found himself alone and walking the parapets once more. This truly was the eve of battle. Close to 5,000 men marched and were less than a day away from the King's Wood. The ships he'd wager had already passed Dragonstone. On the morrow, or at the latest by nightfall, they'd be in a battle once again. Looking to the sky, he saw the moon cast in shadow, and for the briefest moment he swore he saw the outline of a dragon. But it was simply a trick of the light. As dawn began to break, Davos made his way back to his rooms and readied for the day and the battle ahead, cursing the foolish man and woman who couldn't accept their lot in life as he did so. "Lord Jared 30, Lord Jaxley say, Dany." She had never hated Sansa Stark, not truly, until now at least. The girl had made her feelings about her clear from the moment Dany had arrived in Winterfell. Sansa had plotted against her extensively, and yet Dany had not hated her. Even after hearing some of the words she'd spoken about her daughter, Dany had still only disliked the woman who should have been her good sister. For the last few days, however, Dany had begun to feel hatred in her heart for Sansa Stark. Seeing the look on Aegon's face as he readied to fly to Westeros to deal with his cousin once and for all had been the start of it. Listening to her daughter beg and plead for her father to stay with them and not leave had then been enough to truly allow the feeling to grow. Each day they had marched without Aegon by their sides and broken their fasts, eaten their meals, or she had laid in their bed without him, had made her hate Sansa Stark as truly as she had hated anyone. Not even on the morning flights with Rhaxla would she be able to ignore that feeling either. For while her daughter welcomed being in the sky and seeing Rhaxla so close, as soon as they landed, Rhaxla's expression would change. The absence of Rhaxla would again be noticed, and seeing the sad look on Rhaxla's was becoming much too hard to bear. Was it not for Missandei, Ghost, and others, then Dany would have found herself unable to bear it. Had she not got Rhaxla with her, then who knows whether or not she'd have given in to her own sad feelings or allowed her anger to be her guide. As it was, she somehow put on a brave face and did as she must. "We should fly, Dany," Rhaenys said, taking her from yet another daydream where she, Aegon, and Rhaella were playing some game or other together. "What?" she asked, confused, having not heard the beginning or any of the conversation they were engaged in. "I said we should fly, Dany. We're but a day or two from Lorath. While both Lady Kinvara and Lady Melora say we face no true danger there, I'd feel more comfortable if we saw it somewhat for ourselves. You have the right of it, Rosiers. We'll fly when we make camp. They rode in silence for the next few moments. Dany looked to see the carriage that Reimagined rode in, and welcomed seeing Ghost unbothered as he walked alongside it. Her thoughts then turned to what they needed to do in Lorithrath and to where they'd go from there. A part of her wished to go to Bravos, while another wished for nothing more than to climb on Drogon's back and fly to Westeros. Deep down, however, Dany knew she'd do neither. From Lorith it would be Pentos, and then on to the three daughters, the last remaining true holdouts of their conquest of Essos. With good fortune, Aegon should join them on the march to the former. Something that Rhaenys believed was to happen too, given the words she then spoke. He'll be well, Dany. I hold no fear for my brother. Aegon will return long before we reach Pentos. Rhaenys said firmly. I believe so too, she said, just as firmly, finally finding herself able to relax a little at the thoughts of her husband being back by her and Rotsalade's side. With a nod to Rosiers and a glance to her good brother bidding Ned to ride up and take her place, Dany bid her silver to turn and then rode to Rosiers' carriage. She dismounted quickly and with a soft stroke to Ghost's head, Dany then climbed into the carriage and joined her best friend and her daughter. Mama, missed you, Raxley said happily as Missandei moved from her seat to allow Dany to take her place beside her daughter. Missed you too, little dragon, she said as she was enveloped in a most welcome hug and felt her daughter's lips on her cheek as she kissed her happily. The next few hours were first spent playing a game with her daughter and Missandei, and then, to her surprise, napping. Which of them had drifted off first? She knew not. Only that, by the time she had woken, their camp was being set up. With some daylight remaining, she forewent her meal and instead made her way to the dragons. Then she and Rhaenys were soon in the sky and flying towards Lorith. Once they reached the city, they flew high enough so that they'd not be seen, but low enough so they could see all they wished to. There were no defenses being set up and no army laying in wait, which pleased her greatly. The city looked to be one that was not preparing for a battle of any sort. So both Lady Kinvara's and Lady Melora's words were proven even more true. After one last flight over the city, and a quick look to the docks and the sea beyond them, they turned and flew back to their camp. Dany held no meeting with her war council that night. Instead, she ate her meal with her daughter in her arms, and once they'd both eaten their fill, she retired for the night, and bid Rhaenys to inform everyone of what they'd seen. Sleep was easy to come by, much to her surprise, and her dreams were as pleasant as she could have wished them to be. They were of days spent on Dragonstone as she and Aegon watched their daughter grow. Dreams of being held in Aegon's arms and feeling his fingers touch her swollen belly as they watched their daughter sleep. Upon waking the next morning, she felt better than she had in quite a few days. She, Rhaenys, Missandei, and Rhaenys all broke their fast together before Dany held a war council and they began to march once more. 3 days later, they reached Lorath, and Dany looked on from atop her silver as her army surrounded the city. Once they'd done so, Dany made her way to where Ser Brienne and Missandei were. As with any of the cities they'd taken without a fight, the arrangements made to ensure Rosier's safety were of paramount importance, even if they were not as extensive as those made where they faced some opposition. 100 unsullied, almost 1,000 Dothraki, Ser Brienne, and 10 of their best swords along with Ghost and Lacarax. It would take an army to reach Rhaetrada and do her harm. Overkill and overprotective, it may be. Yet Dany cared not. Nor did Aegon, she knew. Neither of them would ever risk their daughter's safety, and until the day came when it was as guaranteed as they wished it to be. Neither of them would ever take even the remotest chance with the most precious thing in both their worlds. Play with Missy Riaz, she said as she kissed her daughter's forehead. Papa coming, Mama? Soon, little dragon. Very soon, she said as she nodded at Missandei and then moved to head to the city itself. In less than 2 hours it was done. The Dany and Rhaenys met with the three princes of the city, the Harvest Prince, the Fisher Prince, and the Prince of the Streets, their roles ceremonial rather than ruling. They met with the true powers of the city, the Magisters. As with the other cities they'd welcomed into the Empire, the rules were simple. Slavery was to be abolished, and while they had time to do so, certain aspects of it were to be done immediately. Coin and goods were to be sent to Westeros, and taxes would be paid directly to them. Each and every year, Again, as with other cities they'd brought under their rule, there was little or no argument in anything she demanded. They were offered a manse for their use and the use of the docks for the arrival of the Dornish fleet. Princess Arianne was soon to depart and head back to Dorne, and while Dany, Rhaenys, and their army would stay but a day or two, they'd be naming the city their home for a little longer. By midday, the day was done, and within 2 more hours they were housed in a manse that was surrounded by more than 2,000 men. All 3 dragons rested in the gardens, and after they'd eaten their meal that night, it was to them that Dany brought Rhaenys. "Rosiax, Mama," Robiella said happily, as the red dragon trilled to see her rider. "Soon you and she can fly together, little dragon, for true," Dany whispered as Rhaenyra stroked Lyfros's snout softly. Holding her daughter in her arms, Dany moved to Drogon and repeated Rhaenys's actions, welcoming the trill that came from her son, as she too softly stroked his snout. To her surprise, she didn't feel the loss of his brother as much as she feared she might. Instead, Dany found herself thinking about Rhaenys's words and welcoming the thought that Aegon and Rhaenys would join them before they reached Pentos. As she did, the memory of the dream she had and the thoughts of a little brother or sister for Rhaenys. Lore 37 AC. Again, seeing Daemon return unharmed was a great relief, as was seeing so many men of Dorne make it through a battle that was almost impossible to comprehend. While Ned Dane and the men he'd brought with him when he went to treat with Daenerys Targaryen had faced the dead before, most of her army had not. Yet they'd kept their nerve and had made Dorne and its princess proud of them all in doing so. Not to mention they'd helped stop the threat that, had it gone unchecked, would have eventually made Dorne thralls to a monster. Never had this been made clearer to her than when they passed by Norvos. To see what had once been a vibrant and full city and was now almost bereft of life was humbling. Even though both Arianne and her mother had been told that the army that Bellico Stagon led was made up mainly of Norvosi, it wasn't until they saw the empty streets and listened to the airy quiet of the city itself that it truly hit home. Arianne did her best to comfort her mother, and she was most grateful for Ariel's help in that regard. Her faithful guard had taken things just as badly as her mother, and since he was from Norvos himself, he'd been able to share in her mother's misery somewhat. There was some life still within the city. Some travelers who'd come by and made themselves a new home there. It would be years, if ever, however, before the city ever was as it once was. While Arianne and her mother spent very little time in the city itself, Daenerys and Rhaenys did not have the luxury of choice in the matter. Things needed to be sorted and a treasury secured. While almost all the wealth of the city was taken from it by the time they left, both her cousin and her queen promised Arianne and her mother that it was but a precautionary thing. In time, they'd see the city well provisioned, and they had already sent word to the Sea Lord to see it garrisoned and made ready for any who wished to name it their home. Her mother would not be among those who'd do so, much to Arianne's joy. "You truly wish to return with me to Dorne?" she asked, hopefully. "There is nothing for me here now, Ari. All those I knew or named as my friends are gone, and while I could stay and see Norvos rebuilt, I have no wish to. My place is by my daughter's side, if she would have me." "Of course she would," she said happily, embracing her mother and hugging her tightly. The closer they got to Loras, the more Arianne put aside thoughts of battles or loss, and instead her mind was filled with nothing but thoughts of the future. Once they returned to Dorne, she and Daemon would be wed. He'd be her husband, and not simply the man she loved. Dorne would from now on be a much larger player in the Seven Kingdoms than it had been for many a year, and she'd have her mother by her side. Just thinking about those things allowed Arianne to put away thoughts of a night without end, or dead things that somehow still moved. Even the brief thoughts that another battle would need to be fought before they could leave Essos behind were ones that were soon put to bed. The Lorathi showed themselves to be far more clever than some had been when it came to facing dragons in the largest army ever assembled. A simple kneeling and swearing of oaths were all it took, and before she knew it, Arianne was alone in what was to be her room for the next few days. Or as alone as she ever hoped to be again. "You seem happier, my love," Daemon said as he moved behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist as Arianne watched the sun go down. "I am Daemon, seeing the sun fall, and knowing it's to rise again, leaving the memories of what we saw and did here, and knowing that soon I'm to be married to the man I love, and soon to be home once more," Daemon said, silencing her first with a kiss, and then with his words. "That too," she said, as she turned to face him. "I wish I could just take you to bed right now and forgo this feast," Daemon said, his desire for her clear in both his eyes and in the swelling in his breeches. As do I, but some things are best savored, are they not? They are, he said, biting her ear softly. Arianne, like him, wished not to attend the feast they were having this night. Was it not for the fact that on the morrow, Rosianes and Daenerys would be leaving Lorith behind and heading to Pentos, then she would not. Had she asked it of either of them, she knew she'd have been given leave to not attend, and yet she could or would not do so. She owed much to Daenerys and Aegon Targaryen, and while only one of them was here, she'd leave her queen in no doubt that her allegiance wasn't just theirs by right, but by choice too. As for Rhaenys, how long it would be until she saw her cousin again, she knew not. Dorne was but a dragon ride away, and Rhaenys was now the Lady of Starfall, among her many other titles. Arianne, however, would wager it would be where Aegon, Daenerys, and Rhaenyra went. That Rhaenys went too. She'd not begrudge her cousin time with her brother, good sister, and niece either. Had her aunt and cousins not lost their minds and her brother his own, then she too may know a brother and good family. Harry? Daemon asked, noticing the frown that appeared on her face at the thoughts of Trystane and Quentyn's loss. One brother she mourned for true, while the other would always be lesser in her eyes. I was thinking of my cousin and of my brothers. Oh, Ari, Daemon said, his arms welcoming and much appreciated as they held her tightly. The feast turned out to be far more enjoyable than she had expected. Rosierne spoke to her far more than she had imagined she would. Arianne had to actually tell her cousin it was allowed for her to spend time with her husband too. Even her mother seemed to be in much better spirits, and so Arianne stayed far longer than she may have otherwise. Still, she was glad when the night came to an end, and even earned so for the night to come when she and Daemon arrived back at their rooms. Waking the next morning, she broke her fast with Daenerys and Rhaenys. It was clear the queen was missing, and worrying somewhat about her husband, though given all Aegon had done and shown he could do, Arianne believed that she had no need to. Their morning meal was a languid affair, time seeming to be almost being willed to stretch on, and yet it was still long before noon when Daenerys and Rhaenys were ready to leave the manse and the city behind them. Arianne, her mother, Daemon, and some of the most important lords, as well as those who'd earned glory in the Battle of Qohor, all lined up to say their farewells, and Arianne felt her emotions rise when she did so. My queen, Dorne and its princess, stand ready, should you ever call for their aid. Arianne said as Daenerys held her hand as if she were a sister and not her queen. We most welcome it, princess. Dorne has proved itself a true ally, and its princess is someone I am most happy to name a friend. As am I, you, my queen. Arianne moved to Rhaenys and was quickly embraced by her cousin. Whispered words and promises of a visit to Sunspear, the Water Gardens, and of rides in the desert together were spoken, and Arianne felt her heart soar at hearing them. She was soon laughing as the little princess and future empress opened her arms for a hug too, and then she, Daemon, and those she'd brought with her to say their farewells, all listened as the queen spoke words of thanks. My husband, were he here, would no doubt say the words I am about to speak, and mayhap even speak them better than me. Daenerys said to some chuckles, we find our true friends on the battlefield, and those of us here have fought in a battle like no other. I name the men and women of Dorne as true heroes and heroines, and I name you all as my true friends. Faced with a man who wished to conquer death and bring us all to our knees, you stood side by side with us and shouted out loudly, we are of Dorne, we are unbowed, unbent, and unbroken. Never forget what you did on the fields of Qohor. For my husband, I, and those you fought with, will never forget the courage you showed that day. Daenerys said loudly, her words carrying to each and every one that was there. With that, they were gone. In less than an hour, an army still far larger than any assembled other than the one that fought at Qohor or Winterfell had marched away from the city, and there wasn't even a sight of the dragons in the sky once they'd done so. Arianne, her mother, Daemon, and Areo made their way back to the manse, and for the next few days they did little of interest. Lorith had delights to offer and sights to see, and yet Arianne spent her days and nights in the manse. She read, wrote out plans for Dorne's future trading and other opportunities, and ate simple meals with her mother and Daemon. Her nights were a little more exciting, as she and Daemon exhausted themselves with each other, though her true excitement came with the arrival of the fleet to take them back to Dorne. They then spent little time in the city once it had done so. In less than a week, the ships were fully loaded, and as she stood on the deck of her flagship, Arianne watched Lorath fade from view. She wore a true smile when she made her way to her cabin, and while she offered up a prayer to whatever gods were listening, She did so with no worry that it would not be answered. Never again would she step foot in Essos, and if she had her way, never again would she leave Dawn. Looking at Daemon as he undressed, and as she slipped her own dress from her shoulders, Arianne vowed that her days and nights would be spent with her husband by her side. She felt she deserved to know such peace and happiness, after all. The Battle of King's Landing 3007 AC. Sir Andrew Estermont. Andrew led the majority of the army, close to 10,000 men at arms he had under his command, while Edric sailed with a little over 5,000. They had feigned going to the north and instead had traveled through the Kingswood with thus far only houses that were loyal to Edric, being who'd see them do so. Try as he might, Andrew could not help but dwell on the last time he'd been involved in an attack on King's Landing. Then it had been him aboard a ship, and so he'd been relieved not to have to do so again. He'd almost jumped at the offer of command of these forces just for that reason alone. As the last thing he needed was to be reminded of the Battle of Blackwater Bay, and what a disaster that had turned into. He'd preached caution to his lord this time around, happy to find that Edric was not Stannis, and he listened somewhat. Even if he did show the pride of the Baratheons when he did so, and the foolishness of Stannis a little as he to listen far too much to a red woman, Andrew didn't agree with his lord's choice of wife or see what she brought to their cause other than her name, a name that actually didn't mean as much as it once had. If truth be told, for Sansa Stark brought no allies from the Vale or the Riverlands, and while he did believe, as Edric did, that she'd prove her worth somewhat once the battle was done, they still had to win that battle in order for her to do so. Not that he believed they would not. They had the element of surprise. Their plans were sound and the dragons were far from these shores. Andrew shook the thought from his mind that they would return as he instead allowed himself to believe that by the time they did so, Westeros would welcome them not. He'd even laughed at the worried words that Set Gerald Gower had spoken when he'd brought up that it was Varys and Davos Seaworth that would be in charge of the city. Andrew had made it very clear how little he thought of the Onion Knight in the process. Was this a battle at sea then? I may concern myself with the Onion Knight, Gerald, but Davos Seaworth is not fighting man, he said dismissively. Was no fighting man, Andrew. Just because he marched with Jon Snow or by Daenerys Targaryen's side doesn't make him any different from the man who marched with Stannis, Gerald. I saw him on the eve of the Battle of Blackwater Bay, walking the beach and sleeping not. As did I, Andrew. Davos not only survived that battle, but he survived whatever it was they faced in the north too. Jon Snow named him Hand for a reason. Andrew, that should give you pause enough. As for Varys, I worry our mummery is not as truly accepted as we believe it to be. I worry not, he said, shaking his head. Gerald had shared his concerns with Edric, who in turn had spoken them to his new wife. It had been Sansa Stark who spoke the truth of Davos Seaworth's military prowess better than any. The Onion Knight had been sent away from Winterfell just as she had been. He'd played no part in the battle that had taken place there. And while it was true that Jon Snow had named him Hand and Daenerys Targaryen had accepted him as such, it was because her bastard cousin was a fool who placed trust over competence, or so Sansa had said. They were harsh words spoken, and while Andrew didn't agree with all of them, he agreed enough to let his doubts be washed away. Something that this march had only managed to allow even more so. Not once did they face even an outrider or see anyone who could give up their position to their enemies. Unlike during Stannis' attack on King's Landing, they weren't engaged in a long drawn-out war, and so no one was expecting them or preparing to defend the city. Setting up camp that night, Andrew found himself keen for the morrow to come. The city was almost in sight, and they would reach it by midday. Given what he expected to find when they arrived there, he'd wager it would fall before night did. He slept a comfortable and dreamless night's sleep, woke early, and broke his fast while japing with his men, and they were back on the march, not more than an hour after he'd arisen from his bed. At what point they felt it, he knew not. They were marching through the Kingswood and would soon be in sight of King's Landing, and yet something felt off to him. When he heard the sound of the horns, they seemed far too close to be true. The arrows that flew, however, were very much so, and Andrew looked on in horror as men fell from their horses and as others came from the trees around them. "Ride, ride, make for open ground," he shouted as he rode down the lines and dodged arrows and even one or two spears that flew his way. To his relief, the losses weren't as bad as they could be, and his words were listened to. Whoever the men who'd attacked them had been was something he'd not learned that day, or so he believed. They'd simply melted back into the trees, and it had allowed his army to march and ride and be free of them before too long. Soon enough, Andrew found himself wishing he was back among the trees, as once again horns rang out, and this time it wasn't arrows or archers that they found themselves dealing with. Instead, it was a cavalry charge, the like of which he'd never witnessed before. "Shield wall! Shield wall!" The order went up, and yet it was a pointless one. Ahead of him stood an army that dwarfed his own. Yet it wouldn't be numbers that were his downfall on this day. Instead, it would be the sheer mass of men and horses that charged toward them. Knights of the Vale, men of the West. Andrew looked on in disbelief as Gerald's words came back to haunt him. As he drew his sword and bid his own horse to charge, he did so with but one thought, and one thought only, in his mind. "I was always destined to die at the gates of King's Landing." Sir Morton Wainwood. When the raven had come from his mother, Morton had set about gathering the men in haste. Not a single one of them not answering the call when he made it. While it should fall to the new warden to lead the Vale into battle, his mother had been adamant that Harold was not to do so. Harold was the last of his line, the last member of House Arryn, even though it was no longer named such. So until he was wedded and had brought forth an heir, Morton knew that his mother wouldn't allow Harold to risk himself unless there was no other choice. It was his mother, too, who had informed them both of how to go about things. Harold called a meeting in the Eyrie where he named Morton as the commander of the Vale army, and bid him answer the Crown's call. Morton then spoke words written by his mother before doing as he'd been bid. By the time they reached the Bloody Gate, he'd gathered close to 7,000 men. The ride to King's Landing was one they did in half the time it would normally take. Morton pushed the men, though not to their limit, and they arrived with time to spare. He was pleased to see that they weren't the only ones to answer the call, and while it surprised him that the men of the West had done so truly, he more than welcomed it. As he did speaking to Sir Davin Lannister, the man quickly proved himself to be a different lion than those who'd come before him, and one that Morton would already name a friend. Though words spoken by some of the men who rode with him and by Sir Davin Hursley, in particular, were ones that Morton would soon enough find the truth of. "We find our true friends on the battlefield. His Grace spoke those words to me and those of us who survived the Battle of Winterfell, and never have truer words been spoken." The battle was now upon them, and it was one that they were well prepared for. Sir Davin had sent archers to harry the Stormlords as they marched through the Kingswood, an ambush that had but two purposes. Firstly, to cause some panic in their ranks, and force them to seek to leave the relative safety of being under cover. Secondly, to take down as many important men amongst their ranks as they could possibly do. Morton knew that some may name it as dishonorable, and yet neither he nor Devon would be amongst those who would. War was not a place for honor. After all, and these men marched to sack a peaceful city, so they deserved all that came their way. "Make ready," he shouted as the first of the horses, and infantry cleared the tress of the Kingswood in front of them. "Hold," he shouted when one or two of the western cavalrymen seemed ready to charge, his words stopping them and Morton receiving a nod from Sir Davin, who was further down the line to his left. He waited until enough of the Stormlords had cleared the trees before he steadied his lance in his hands. Once he'd done so, then and only then did he give the order. "For King Aegon and Queen Daenerys, for Lord Harold and the Vale, charge!" There were some sounds that filled you with awe and wonder, some that brought you nothing but terror and horror. Morton believed that the charge he was now engaged in was one that managed to do both. Among his men and those who rode as their allies today, he would wager they felt the former. Looking at those they charged against, he was under no illusion that they felt anything but the latter of those two things. From his vantage point, even during his own ride, Morton could see the panicked looks on the faces of those who were trying in vain to form a shield wall. As the horses' hooves thundered over the hard ground beneath them, he lowered his lance, and less than a moment later he felt it hit home. Unlike during a joust, it was not blunted lances they bore, and the feel of the strike hitting home was much different because of it. The sharpened metal tip cut through the armor of the man it struck and took his life from him long before he reached the ground. Steadying his hand once more, Morton soon was repeating the motion over and over, until the lance struck home so truly that it was lost to him when the man it impaled fell to the ground and took it with him. Reaching behind him to take out his morning star, it was with that he then began to fight. Around him, it was pure carnage. The charge had been as successful as they could have ever wished it to be. Their enemy's lines weren't just broken, but they were destroyed, and this battle was now close to being a rout. A glance at where the Westerland's men and Sir Davin were was enough to cost Morton his mount, and he cursed his foolishness as he hit the ground hard, rolling out of the way of a riderless horse as it almost rode over him. Morton rose to his feet and spit out the blood that had pooled in his mouth from the fall. He'd bitten his lip, and thankfully that was the extent of his injuries. Taking a moment to survey his surroundings, the true extent of their victory was soon apparent. Morton had fallen in what should be deep behind the Stormlord's lines, and yet there was no foe or enemy for him to face. "Sir Morton," a voice called out from behind him, and Morton turned to see Sir Davith leading 2 horses his way. "I thank you, Sir Davith. I seem to have lost my mount." "Ha, be thankful that's all you lost here today." Sir Dad jepped. "Indeed," he said, smiling back at the man, as he took the offered reins. "Is it as true a victory as I think? I'd wager so." "Come, let's make sure, shall we?" "We had better," he said, nodding his head as he and Davith both mounted the horses. It took them close to an hour to find Sir Davin and to see those men who'd been taken as prisoners. Other than the few men who'd run and found their way back into the King's Wood, the Stormlords and their men had surrendered once the charge was over. One single charge was all it had taken to break an army of close to 10,000 men. The battle had turned out to be a completely different one than it could have been, and Morton could only thank the gods, Lord Davos and Lord Varys, for that. As he made his way to where Sir Davin stood, the fighting now completely over, he wondered if they would ride to King's Landing and offer their aid there, or if this was to be the end of their battle this day. Either way, Morton was more than ready for it. Yet it was thoughts of the words that Sir Davin had said that he greeted his fellow commander. For he'd named Sir Davin and the men of the West as his true friends now, and he'd wagered that he was not alone in doing so.